Hi, we're going live today with Elisheva Liss to talk about talking to our kids about sex and sexuality. Elisheva and I have already done this maybe once or even twice before, but I feel like this is a topic that, hi Elisheva, okay, I'm just asking her to join. Oh, hi!
Hey, how are you?
Good. Baruch Hashem, how are you? Thank you so much for being willing and agreeing to do this with me.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, especially about this, but really always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks. Same. Also, I was telling everybody that we've already done this before, but I think it's so important and really not talked about enough, and still something that so many people are uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important.
Yeah.
So I just want to keep having the conversations.
Thank you. Yes, me too.
Yeah. Okay. So, Elisheva, do you want to introduce yourself just for anybody who might not know who you are, and tell them, who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks for inviting me. Hi, I'm Elisheva Liss. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice. I also write. I have a blog. You can look at more of my writing on elishevaliss.com. I also, in recent years, so I have a specialty treating sexual dysfunction with adults, usually in marital relationships. But whenever I was lecturing about sexuality, healthy sexuality for adults, inevitably the conversation will always turn to, the Q&A at the end will always turn to like, but what about the kids? Like, people are always recognizing how the education that they got or didn't get what, like when they were growing up, played into their adult relationships, relationship with their body, with their romantic partner, with sex itself, and they want to do better for the next generation. This is something that we hear over and over again from parents, and over again from young adults saying, I wish I had heard more from the trusted adults in my life, particularly parents. And so thankfully, thank God, I think that in our times, like even in the last 5 to 10 years, we're seeing a tremendous increase in the number of parents, and I would also say communities and organizations and groups who are inviting us to talk about these things, to share material. There's an increase in material on these things. And I think that as the world becomes a place that is more sexually expressive in a lot of different ways, it becomes even more and more vital to generate the kind of healthy sexual messaging and healthy messaging in general about values, about self-esteem, about morality, about whatever it is that we want to convey to our families, our students, and ourselves in a way that's very intentional, very educated, very thought through. And it's a process, whenever I give these talks, I'm always a little bit more than a little bit apprehensive, because we're always all learning new things all the time. And so, there might be something that I said 5 years ago, maybe we did a talk a few years ago, and now I've amended it. And that's fine, because we're all on a journey. We're all figuring things out as we go along. There's always new research, always new developments. But I think it's really important for us to stay, ahead of this, this unfolding of human history and child development, and particularly the sexual piece, because it is so personal and so sensitive and such a big part of development and adult relationships. And, I'm hoping that by talking about it in ways that are, culturally sensitive and values-based, we can do better for the kids. And in the end, like, after all of these lectures where I would get to talking about parents, it was like frustrating, because we would spend like those last 15-20 minutes of Q&A talking about something that really deserved its own lecture altogether. So I started doing lectures on sex education, and even that, the hour and change wasn't enough. So eventually I created a course that was, several hours long, and it made it as a digital course. I think maybe I'll do a code for this that we can say at the end, so that if people want to get it, we can do an affordability code. But the bottom line is that, you don't have to do a whole big expansive course. You don't have to read 1,000 books, a little bit of information, a little bit of confidence, a little bit of, openness to talk and listen to our children can go a very, very long way. So I'm excited to talk about this with you, Blini. I was looking for my notes from our last time that we spoke, and I couldn't find them. So I figured I'm going to rely on you to prompt with good, kind of questions and cases.
Yeah. And also the people here can ask if they want to, if they want to ask something. But I love how you explained it. Okay, there's a few things that I relate. First, when you said I'm always apprehensive because I might have changed my mind in 5 years, and maybe, I completely relate. And I for sure said things that I don't agree with anymore, in the past. And at the same time, I think that it's so important though. We have to start somewhere. We have to have these conversations, and we can it just means that we're learning and we're growing. Also, I'm curious about something. So you said when you spoke about you know, sexuality with adults, they eventually always spoke about the kids. I'm curious for you, as somebody who works with couples, do you see like the importance of speaking to children about it? Like, I want to hear about that.
Yes, definitely. You know, so I don't know exactly who your audience is now these days. I think it's grown a lot since the last time we did this, which is amazing.
It's very vast. There's all kinds of people here.
Yeah. So, you know, full disclosure, the primary demographic that I work with, both in my practice and in terms of the audience that I get invited to lecture to, is usually religious, faith-based audiences. And so most of the information is that I have is sort of anecdotal and empirical and based off of, you know, that particular demographic. But what I've learned from, that's a sweet comment. What I've learned from talking to colleagues who serve different populations is that it's not as different. You know, these core issues are not as different as one might think. I think that, you know, I've heard this said before. I don't know who originated this idea, but I've seen it written down and spoken about in a number of places that, you know, a lot of people's core fears, you know, the core anxieties, our core insecurities that we struggle with are the fears of inadequacy, and unlovability, right? Like at the heart of like what we really worry about existentially is, am I enough? Am I good enough? Am I worthy? And by extension, like, am I lovable? Like, is someone going to love me? Are people going to accept me? Will I belong? And that's not just in the sexual realm. It's in you know, globally, like in general, like, am I good enough in every way? You know, and I think that it plays out most meaningfully though in intimate partner relationships, right? Because the most important person that we want to feel like loved and loving towards and loved by is you know, a primary partner, you know, and we want to feel good enough that we can, you know, show up authentically. We don't have to like hide and shame parts of ourselves, you know, again, physically, emotionally, in every way. And we want to make it safe and comfortable for our partners to do the same. And so the same way, there's like a parallel process with self-esteem, right? How do we feel about ourselves? How do we feel about other people in general, right? How do we socialize? How do we communicate? How do we connect with people? How do we filter? How do we figure out like, oh, that's a good friend for me. Maybe that's not such a good friend for me. How do I respond when the feedback is positive? There's so many people who don't deal well with compliments, right? How do I respond when the feedback I get isn't so good? That hurt my feelings, right? Like learning these ways of navigating interpersonal relationships, even outside the realm of sexuality, just relationships, are skills that start even in preschool, even before preschool. And so the way we relate to our bodies and our developing sexual selves, and sexuality is not like a separate compartment from physical or psychological development. It's very heavily integrated, you know, is such an important part of how things project the trajectory that follows into adulthood. So when I have young men or young women who have tremendous shame around their bodies, around their sexualities, around their thoughts, their feelings, their desires, things that they might have watched or thought about or fantasized about or done at a different point in their lives. All of this comes back to, and this is not, God forbid, about like parent blaming or making anyone, you know, wrong or at fault for, you know, but it's just kind of, you ask the question of like, to what extent does like the education, upbringing, the parenting play into adult relationships? Very, very, very significantly. So many people will tell me like in the very first 5 minutes of a session, like, you know, growing up, I knew I didn't want to have the kind of marriage that my parents had. Or, you know, growing up, I knew there was always something like uncomfortable, you know, when I got my period, I didn't feel like I could talk to my parents about it, or, you know, that kind of thing. Or the opposite. Sometimes people will say like, you know, I feel very privileged that, you know, my parents gave me a really great education, a really good sense of, you know, what my body was. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't self-conscious, you know, and most people are not all bad or all good. You know, a lot of people will say, oh, you know, my parents did a great job on this, but I wish I'd had more information about that. But statistics and studies will show that people almost always will say that they wish they had known more. And specifically, they wish they had known more from trusted adults in a biologically accurate and sex positive, healthy, values-based ways. Because something that I talk about a lot is that if we don't teach our children, if trusted adults don't teach their children healthy sexuality, healthy body image, healthy relationships, boundaries, safety, pleasure, all that stuff, they're going to learn it from like 3 general sources, which are, you know, peers, pornography, or God forbid, predators, because those are the sources that unfortunately are all more than happy to, you know, be the resource, if not for us. And so we don't really have the luxury in this day and age to say like, oh, well, they'll figure it out on their own. They'll figure it out on their own. But like, there's a tremendous price that we pay for allowing that to just happen however it happens. And we see that in our therapy offices. We see that, you know, when you talk to audiences, we see that in the emails and direct messages that we get from people saying, oh my gosh, I thought it was just, Brene Brown has a phenomenal phenomenal book called something like I Thought It Was Just Me, but It Wasn't, about personal shame. And I think it's such a brilliant title for a book. She's a brilliant person. Because I think so much of the shame that people carry in general is like, I'm the freak, like there's something wrong with me. No one else has this problem, only me. Now, when it comes to other areas of self-consciousness or shame, people sometimes do talk about these things, especially in social media. Oh, I feel like I have imposter syndrome at work. I don't feel beautiful. There are other areas that it's like okay to talk about our insecurities. But the sexual self is something that still, depending on what community you're part of and what social group you're from, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of discomfort. And, I think we still have some work to do. We're seeing tremendous progress. It's wonderful what people are doing, but there's always room to do better, I think.
Yeah, I so agree with you and so hear you. So basically you're saying that most people, I love that all studies, I guess, will show that people will say, I wish I had heard more and more from trusted adults. So it's kind of like showing that really, and okay, so now I want to ask for the parents who think there might be, because I speak to parents about this a lot of times, and I'll say, speak to your child about this. And a lot of them have worries and concerns about it. Like, what if I'm going to traumatize them? What if they're going to be traumatized by what I say? How do I know how much to say or what to say? And how do I know it's too early? And also, what's wrong with them finding out from their peers? Maybe that's better than finding out from me. And parents have a lot of people also say, like, what if I talk about pornography to them? Then they're going to say, I want to see it. I'm curious about it. Like, they're worried it's going to bring, something like the child didn't know it exists. Now you're bringing something to their existence. And now they're going to be curious about it.
Yeah. These I actually have in the talks that I usually give, and in my secret course, that's the name of the sex ed course, 10 most common concerns that parents have when it comes to talking about sex education. I think you hit on like 6 of them. And they're
because I hear this all the time. Yeah.
And they're all valid. I would say the most valid one is, I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, because it's not wrong. Meaning, it is better to wait until you're somewhat informed and somewhat educated. And and there are some people, this is hard to accept, but there are some people who have a better like intuitive sense of like how to parent than others. Maybe a combination of nature and nurture. If you were raised in a home where you really want to emulate a lot of, the wholesome parenting that you were privileged to get, or sometimes the opposite, like you figure out, like I've heard people say, like, I'm a really good parent because I do exactly the opposite of one of my parents, but I think for a lot of people, they're like, some people just have that more like sort of nurturing, perceptive, intuitive kind of personality. And some people have to learn it kind of as a second language. But it can be learned. There's what I think of as talent and there's skill. Talent is like that natural inborn. Some people are born knowing how to sing on key, and some people would have to really study music and take voice lessons to learn how to sing well. But I think that many things, if you don't have the talent, you could gain the skill. So I think maybe at the end, we'll suggest some resources. And I know that on my website, if you go on elishevaliss.com and click on the resources, I have lots and lots of books of different styles, books for parents, books for children, books written specifically from a religious vantage point, because, education from a religious vantage point is going to differ significantly from a more liberal progressive vantage point. And there's, not as much material about that, but I do have the handful of stuff that I've seen that I really like and feel good about. I've linked on my website. So you don't have to go this alone. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to stab in the dark. Like, there are resources that you don't have to do like a PhD in sex education to be qualified to teach your children. Another really great tool to have, again, about sex education or anything else that children come to us with, is a buffer zone. So to be able to say, like, I am so grateful that you came to me with that question, or you came to me with that, situation or story that you told me. And I really want to talk to you about it. I actually want to hear a lot more about it. But before I give you any ideas or answers or advice, I actually want to do a little bit of homework myself. I want to speak to maybe my co-parent, maybe a mentor that I respect, maybe look and, do some research, a book, a professional. And I think that people are sometimes nervous to say that to children or students for that matter, but I actually think that gives a message of humility, of honesty, of modeling to children that we don't have to know everything right away, that we believe in learning and speaking to people so that we can do well with things. But the kicker is you have to come back to it. You can't just say like, oh, let me talk to someone and get back to you, and then never get back to them. So I think in terms of like the fear of not knowing knowing what we don't know, I think it's wonderful to know what we don't know. I think it's okay to do an imperfect, responsible but imperfect job. I think starting with a little bit of knowledge. There's a great quote I love by Dr. Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better, and then do better, right? And I think that's true, again, of parenting, and it's true in a universal way as well. So in terms of that concern, that would be my response, is that let's, make ourselves somewhat educated. And another really great tool that they say is, if a kid comes to you with a question, you don't know the answer, another way to respond is, that's a great question. What do you think? And sometimes the what do you think to a child is such a wonderful segue to find out, like, they might not even need so much information from you. They may even have the information at their, you know, fingertips once they probe their own knowledge or experience. They may be looking for something different, less, you know, more simple than what you thought they needed. Like the classic example is like a kid comes to this joke, but a kid comes to the parent and says, where did I come from? And the parent's like, it's like, oh, because my friend came from California and I didn't know where I was born. It's not that you don't want to give an accurate answer, but in that moment, the kid just wanted to know, like, am I originally from this neighborhood or whatever, you know? So sometimes asking the child, what do you think? What do you know? You know, kind of playing it out with them, jamming with them, helps you figure out where their head is already at. And then based on what they answer, either they could come up with an answer on their own, or you know what questions to follow up with and what wavelength they want to go on. And then again, back to answer number one, how to research it, how to come back to them with information that would be helpful. So that was the main question of, like, what if I say the wrong thing? What were some, I have my notes up actually. There's the uncertainty, that's for the first one, the discomfort of not feeling like you know, the language, that's part of doing research. Peer concerns, was that one of the ones that you said, like the concern that they're going to go tell their friends?
Oh, I actually didn't say that, but yeah, that is it's a huge concern for parents that they're going to tell their friends.
Yeah. So I think, the other one that you said was, I don't want to put ideas in their head.
Right? Yeah, like they're going to be curious then what that is. Yeah.
Yes. So here's the thing. They're going to get curious at some point anyway, right? So you might be preempting the curiosity by a year or two. But the approach that I favor, which is to really start this education in a very sort of sequential, holistic way, you're talking in a very straightforward, not like scandalous, salty way about it, like from a very young age. And so, you know, when you teach kids the proper names for their genitals when they're like 2, 3, and 4 years old, and they're playing head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and, you know, in the bath, you're telling them like what they're cleaning, they don't register as like, ooh, wow, mommy said peanut, you know, like that's not where they're going with it. You know, it's just like you're giving it over to them as like just very normal information. And so by the time they would get to the age where it becomes like exciting to talk about and like in hush, they're already like over that, like they're already too mature for that to be like a big deal for them. That being said, even with the best of education in that realm, at a certain point, they're going to have these hormonal feelings. They're going to be, you know, exposed to dirty jokes and peer pressure and maybe social media, you know, like you can't like bubble wrap them in positive education. But you know, they're going to get curious. And so they're going to be less curious and less shamey and less like hiding, sneaking around behind closed doors if they know that we're a safe, open door place to come and talk about these things. You know, so similarly to the way, let's say, this is a question that nobody asks. Why do they do fire drills in school? We don't want to scare children about the idea that sometimes there are fires. Nobody asked that question, right? And there are children who are scared of fire drills, right? That does sometimes happen. And we have to try to make fire drills as not unnecessarily scary as possible, but a little bit urgent because we need to know that there's a way to deal with fire, right? And I don't know anyone that was ever in a school where there was a fire and everybody had to run out via a fire drill. Like, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that has happened in the history of humanity, but more often it's happened that a person needed to have better sex education, again, because they were confronted by peers, porn, or predators. And so I think that there are ways of preparing people, for kids, adults, you know, for things in a way that's not neurotic, that's not anxiety inducing, that doesn't make it like transgressive in a way that's like so exciting, like I need to do that terrible thing that my mother told me about, or my father told me that. It's more just kind of like, you know, we teach kids and adults about all kinds of things that we need to like either embrace or avoid or moderate or whatever. And if we do it, again, in a wholesome, straightforward way, is there a small risk or possibility that it's going to make them curious? Yes, there is that risk. It's a very, very low risk. And, you know, the limited studies that we have on this seem to indicate that kids who are educated, again, from trusted adults in a wholesome way, are less likely to act out sexually and less likely to end up in, you know, with sexual dysfunction in the ways that kids who are not educated. But yes, there's a possibility that you're sort of like taking away that tiny little bit of their, you know, ignorance. But ignorance and innocence are not the same thing. You know, and it's
to say, people think it's the same.
Right. It's not the same. It's not the same. You know, a kid who doesn't know anything, okay, there's a certain innocence about them, but they're also so much more vulnerable and susceptible to either, you know, other influences, the peer pornography, predator influence, and also eventually when their sex drive kicks in, they get so confused. I can't even tell you how many young men and women I've had come to me saying like, I want to date for marriage, but I'm a religious person and I know I'm a sexual deviant. They're not a sexual deviant. They're a sexual person. And they just didn't know what their thoughts and feelings and masturbation and desires meant because they had no framework to conceptualize it. Yeah. So ignorance that they thought was innocence actually turns into a huge internal complex that sometimes plays out later in marriage with a person who feels too ashamed to show up in an authentic way because they just don't have the vocabulary, the normalization, the confidence, the clarity on what those thoughts and feelings and urges and curiosities mean. And then particularly if they ended up finding information online that was not accurate and not helpful and not healthy, then where are they supposed to go with that? So again, always back to this, like there are always risks that we take, but like you have to do a risk analysis. And to me, the risk of kind of leaving it to chance is much, much higher than the risk of introducing information at an age that other people might think is premature. But, I think, and, most of my colleagues would agree is wise. And again, we do it at a an incremental, age appropriate, culturally sensitive way. The language that we introduce, the concepts that we introduce. I don't believe that it should be one big bombshell conversation. On the contrary, I think that there's like little building blocks that accumulate over time so that it's not a shock to the system. That's the kind of thing that like slowly but surely they ask questions, you have conversations, there are interactions, there are opportunities that present themselves in kind of an organic way to drip this information in ways that are healthy and wholesome and helpful so that when things happen, a classic example that you could give is like preparing a girl for her first period, right? So that's another great example. Like, oh, I don't want to freak her out. I don't want it to be that she's not. No. If you don't tell her, that's more likely to freak her out when she just starts bleeding one day on a school trip. And she's like, oh, what's going on with me? She'll be embarrassed. She'll be messy. But if when she gets to the age of, at this point, I would say at least like really 8 or 9, because the kids are getting their periods younger, she has a discreet little maxi pad in her knapsack. She knows what to do with it. You practice putting it on the bed, then she's not freaked out because you didn't give her anything to freak out about. You said, oh, this is a thing that happens and it's fine and it's healthy and we need to deal with it. And this is how, and we don't make her nervous. We make her, empowered and prepared. Right. And so obviously people feel more comfortable talking about periods because it's not sex. But, I think we need to prepare a boy for their first wet dream. Same thing. First time that happens, he could be mortified or he could be like, oh, that's that thing that my father told me about. Okay, I understand that. That's a normal thing. And then they don't have that agonizing shame that goes along with it that they carry, again, especially if they're religious. But even if not, like if they don't understand what's happening with their bodies, it's so complicated and unnecessarily upsetting for them. Whereas, knowledge is power. And culturally sensitive, values-based knowledge is even more empowering, I think. I'm talking so much. You can interrupt me at any point.
Yeah. No, oh my gosh, I love everything you're saying. And there's so many things I want to add and also like clarify and ask. So I love what you said about like, it should be like slow information, a little bit drip. I love that visualization of like drip, a little bit at a time. Cause I think that, and the opportunities do present themselves. Children ask questions that you can answer in a way that's, like you said, age appropriate, culturally sensitive, etc. And I really, really find in my experience, I was terrified to say certain things to my kids at certain ages because I was like, that's way too young. Like it's way too young for a 6-year-old to know about a period. But actually, guess what? My 6-year-old knew about a period and she's fine. And actually, I think to me, like the older my children get, the more I realize that I actually think it's better to say it when they're younger. Meaning like it's even less scary like that. It's even less of a deal. It's just like, all right, obviously women get their periods. It's just a thing, right? It becomes a fact of life. Totally. And I think like you said, we're coming a long way in our communities. And like, I know in the schools, in the girls' schools by us, like when the girls are 11 and 12 years old, they'll talk to the parents about how to talk to their kids about puberty. I think that's way too late though. Yeah. Way too, I'm like, whoa, what's happening? Like these girls are, this is way too late.
Yes, but I'm happy that you brought that up because that is something that I think my opinion on it is a little different than a lot of other people's opinion. A lot of people point to the schools, and I actually don't think it should be the schools that are in charge of this education. I like what schools offer resources for parents. But, you know, especially we see what's going on with a lot of like the tension between public schools and parent bodies now in the general, you know, at least in the United States. I don't know where people are watching from. But, you know, I think in the world in general, there's like certain tension about, you know, schools giving values and messaging that parents are like, hold on, we never signed up for that. Right. And I think that in religious communities, we have like a similar issue. Obviously, if you're sending your kid to a religious school, you're counting on certain amounts of religious a lot of religious messaging. But specifically with sex education, because it is so sensitive and because it is the kind of thing that I believe most of it should be done one-on-one, not in a group setting. And, you know, from an adult that's like really in a child's life, not like a teacher that they're having for a year along with 25 other kids, you know. So I don't point to the schools. I do think, and it's funny, I get bombarded with invitations from schools, which this makes me so happy. Not because I like to speak publicly, actually don't, but because what it represents in society, you know, saying, could you come and do a training for our teachers about how to incorporate, you know, positive messaging about bodies, about sexuality, about puberty, about, you know, in even like religious classes, which makes me so happy. I'm working on a curriculum for that. But I know modesty is like a big issue that people have, you know, when teaching the boys, you know, to what extent we want to train them, you know, to become like, you know, gentlemen, you know, if you're religious, then religious law-abiding gentlemen, but certainly, you know, boys who can treat women with respect. And, you know, so I think that there's definitely room for schools to be more savvy and more integrated with this material. But I actually prefer for it to be the purview of the parents. But I totally agree that leaving it till middle school is like, it's too late already. They've already had fantasies. They've already masturbated. They've already been exposed to dirty jokes. They've already probably seen porn on the internet. I'm not exaggerating. Like this is the world that we're in right now. You know, in terms of like fantasy and masturbation, that probably was going on pre-internet as well. But I think that there's a hypersexualization of society that happened even after the sexual revolution of the 60s, that really got like, you know, like hit the gas with the internet. And there's no putting what's the expression, genie back in the bottle, whatever, cat back in the bag, whatever. Yeah. We just need to deal with it now. And this is the world. And no matter how sort of insular or sheltered your community or your home is, it's not. Meaning it might be relative to other communities and homes, but every infiltration system, every filter system has a lot of holes in it. And no matter how, you know, religious or sheltered you think your children are, eventually they're probably going to discover, you know, sexuality, whether it's their own individual experience of sexuality or other people, or if you want, you know, if the plan is that they're going to get married or have relationships one day, you know, we all need to be. Another analogy that I like to give is like, imagine we all agree that like we want children to have like a healthy self-image, right? But it would be absurd to say, oh, you know what, but before they turn like 12 or 13, we're going to bring in a speaker to tell everybody you should feel good about yourself. Okay, bye. Right? Like that would be bizarre, right? If we want to foster, you know, healthy self-esteem, healthy confidence, you know, healthy resilience in children, this is like an ongoing conversation that happens in the course of like thousands of comments and interactions that we have with them over the course of their childhood in different iterations and contexts. And I think that, you know, sex education isn't so different from that. I mean, it's not as broad, but, you know, we live in our bodies, right? We take care of our bodies, you know, hygiene and aesthetics and how we dress them and how we set boundaries and how we engage with other people's bodies. There's such a wealth of ways to communicate all the different messages. Because I think what ends up happening, I know in our religious communities, this is something that happens. The normalization of talking about sexual safety happened before the normalization of talking about sexuality in general. And so you have a generation and a half, about approximately, of children who were raised on an imbalance of messaging. The only sexual education that they got was like, you know, first it was stranger danger, then they figured out that strangers aren't the biggest danger. So, you know, body boundaries and, you know, my body belongs to me and, you know, people shouldn't touch you inappropriately. And all of that messaging is super, super important. I was bombarded this month with like so many organizations and synagogues that wanted people to come in and talk about, you know, before summer and pools and camp and sleepaway and whatever, like we need to arm parents with knowledge. And it's amazing. And I'm so glad that that is happening because it is a priority and it's critical. But what ends up happening is when the only education that they're getting is sexual safety and sexual danger, then the only framework that they have for sexuality is like, oh, there are people who want to hurt me or take advantage of me sexually. And then there's no concept of like, but actually the primary use of our sexuality is pleasure and procreation and romance and relationship and enjoyment. So then you have to shift gears eventually when they get to an age where it's appropriate for them to tap into that, you know, sexual positivity and pleasure. And by that point, it's a very skewed, you know, you have to correct and it leaves an impression. So
Wow, yeah, like I love that, but like there has to be, you want it to be a balance of like,
Yeah.
yeah, not just like the downsides of like sexuality or like, yeah, it's also like you said, the primary purpose is for pleasure. So yeah, and by the way, I wanted to say with the schools, what I meant was I wasn't clear. They talk to parents about how to talk to their children about it,
Okay.
but they're telling them when the children are in middle school, which I think is way too late. It's like start much earlier. Why are we waiting till the last minute?
Totally.
And I think that we start things late because like of all the reasons that we said before, because there's fear, because there's discomfort, because there's shame, because we're like, we don't want to put ideas into our heads. But I think like what you said, I find that the earlier we tell them, the more normalized it is. And also the less like taboo and interesting it is when they find out. Like you were saying, like, I think that in middle school, you see a lot of kids like whispering and joking about things and like, saying like different words instead of breast. And I find that like my children who have been hearing about this from like, who knows, from when they were like tiny, that it's really not that interesting. Yeah. It's like, I don't really get why everyone keeps like, using funny words for breasts.
Yeah.
It's,
they probably find it immature.
Yeah. I think they find it I don't think they relate to it really.
Yeah. The analogy that I sometimes give is I remember when my son, who's now an adult, was 3, his teacher called me and she said, your son just said the funniest thing. I said, what? She said, he was drinking some water and he started coughing. And I said, are you okay? And he said, yeah, it's just the water. It went down my trachea instead of my esophagus. and like that, like I thought that was hysterical. I was like, well, I just kind of feel like if we give them like the most biologically accurate information that they could have, then they just know what's going on and they don't even get scared of choking. Like it's just very matter of fact. So it's like it doesn't feel. I mean, you should be scared of actual choking, but like coughing on water. Even actual choking. If you teach them the choking sign, then they know how to get the help that they need. So I agree with you 100%. The more biologically accurate we can be in a like not like shocking way of just like, oh, that's your penis, that's your vulva, that, another thing is, I think back to what you were saying before about how a lot of people just assume you can wait till middle school or adolescence or prepubescence to like start having these conversations. But 2 of the most common questions I think that I get in this realm, like of sex education, one is, at what age should I teach my kids about sex? And my answer is always at all the ages, right? Obviously, you're not teaching about like sexual intercourse between, but at every single age. But like, it's really like a cumulative curriculum that happens even like, I would say infancy, like the way we and kiss and create love around touch with a baby. It's not sexual in an inappropriate sense, but that's laying the foundation and the groundwork for giving over the message that like being held is comforting, being held is wonderful, right? The babies that didn't get held in post-war orphanages failed to thrive. This is something that people know, right? So, also for toddlers, we keep our hands to ourselves. We don't hit our friends. Like, right? We decrease the likelihood of intimate partner violence when we raise toddlers and preschoolers who learn how to calibrate their anger and not hit, right? So every stage, and not hitting is an investment in their sexual relationship, because sexual violence is a real problem, right? People who get angry and don't know how to not hit, they're going to ruin their intimate relationships. So there's like 1,000 different ways to educate at every stage along the life cycle. And that's why I think, it's so important to start having these conversations at all ages. So that's the first question. At what age do we educate? All the ages. Second question that I get a lot, is I found my young child rubbing up against a piece of furniture, rubbing themselves with their hands, pleasuring themselves. And often these parents are like, what is wrong with my kid? My kid's a sicko, or my kid must have been abused. Or it's like, no, your kid is a person and people are sexual creatures. And, some kids masturbate spontaneously and some don't. But there's nothing aberrant. There's nothing like deviant about a child who figures out that something feels good. The same way some kids, twirl their hair or suck their thumbs, or, like kids develop habits. And that's a habit. I think there's even some indication that people have seen people self-pleasuring in utero. It's the same way, again, babies suck their thumbs in utero. They put, your body is an interesting thing. And when you notice like, oh, when I do that thing, it generates a cool sensation, then you're going to do it again. And so, people get very alarmed and they start saying things to their kids that are either shaming or whatever. So I think finding ways to respond to these are wonderful opportunities to educate. And it's one of these questions that I don't love answering in public, because there are different variables at play about how you're going to address the answer. But, you know, as well-informed parents to do that research, you know, there's even free content online. You know, if you know, do Google searches for good, you know, sex education material, there's like a lot of free stuff. There's free stuff on my website. You probably have stuff. There's books that you can buy that are very affordable. There's courses, you know, there really are more and more ways that you can, you know, access material relatively easily, and make yourself knowledgeable so that, you know, you can give the kids the feedback that they need in order to foster healthy relationships with their bodies, with their thoughts, with their feelings, with their, you know, developing sexuality, and not just healthy in the sense of like, oh, everything's okay, I can do whatever I want. No, that's not healthy, right? Health requires boundaries also. We want it to be mostly a positive experience, but like we want to teach our children to be, you know, socially appropriate, sexually appropriate. We want them to have the right kind of boundaries. We want them to respect other people's boundaries. Like it's you know, the balance in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that. And that makes so much sense that those are the most common questions that you get. So I actually saw a question while we were talking. I saw a question come in. I'm very curious about how you would respond to it. Somebody said, I would never have wanted my parents to talk to me about sex and sexuality. So I don't want to talk to my kid about it. Like, can I just give them a book?
Okay. So in terms of that person, I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that person's question because I don't know how old her kids were. I don't know what she was exposed to. I don't know, or he knows. I don't know what they know. But when a person says, I would never have wanted my parents to talk to me about sex, it's because they had the kind of parents that probably didn't talk to them about sex. So that's the nature of the relationship, is like, I don't want you to do that because it would be weird because you never did that before. So, right. So,
right.
You know, and yes, and that actually is a good point. Every so often, not so often, but every so often, I'll have someone who say like, my parents overspoke to me about sex. Not really? Because their parents, I mean, that also unfortunately is the thing, but I'm not talking about parents who were sexually unboundaried in ways that were, you know, exploitative of their children. I'm talking about, let's say, you know, oh, my mom or my parents were hippies and they were like into walking around the house naked. Well, that would be unboundaried behavior, but you know, they were just like a little too open. Mm-hmm. And you know, and they talked about it even when I didn't want to. And so I think one of the things, you know, there's sort of like 3 prompts, I think, that can offer opportunities to have these conversations. One, and I think the best one, is child initiated. You know, so if a kid comes to you and says, I heard this word and I don't know what it means, or I had a question, I was thinking about something, that's an actual red carpet invitation. Your child has a question, they have a curiosity. This is a wonderful chance to like really get in there and talk to them about it, you know, at a time that they are, you know, clearly expressing that they're interested and open to learning about it. Then there are situational things, right? So let's say you're walking out in public somewhere and you see a couple making out on the bench, right? And the kid looks and says, what are they doing? You know, so I guess that's also child initiated, but they might not say what they're doing, but you see them looking. So there's a situation and it presents itself, or they're going to sleepaway camp or whatever. And there's opportunities that are situational, that are circumstantial, that you have to be able to say, oh, this is what's going on. Mommy's pregnant. There's somebody's breastfeeding. But, you know, there are situations that lend themselves to it. Those are also good because they're circumstantial. There's not a lot of pressure. The third way is parent initiated. So if your child is not asking a lot of questions and there's not, you haven't seen circumstances that arose that really gave you an opening to do this, you still as a parent might feel like, I kind of want to manufacture an opportunity to talk. When you're doing it like that, and by the way, most families have all 3. It's not like one, you only have one always or the other. But when you're doing it like that, I think like with any other way of attuning to our children, we want to pay attention and read the room. So if your kid says, oh, I just ate dinner at the neighbor's house, you don't force them to sit down and eat dinner because they're not hungry and they don't, well, you should never force kids to eat, but you know, you're not going to give them dinner because you know they just ate, right? So if you say to your kid, hey, there's this thing that I've been wanting to talk to you about, and you know, say, is that okay? Is now a good time? You know, whatever. Then you're giving them sort of the opportunity to consent to this conversation. Something that a lot of experts will recommend is try to do it in a multitasking kind of way. If you have a kid who's self-conscious, so like while you're driving, so they don't have to like look you in the eye while you're talking about this, or while you're sort of pottering around the kitchen with them, and you know, like, oh, by the way, I was thinking about this thing. But know your audience. So this goes back to like the broader relationship that a parent and child have with one another. Again, a child who says, I would never want my parent to do X with me or to talk to me about A, B, or C. That's probably because they don't necessarily have the closest relationship to that parent, and that's a shame. So if you don't have such a close relationship to your child and you recognize that limitation, I would encourage you to talk to somebody like me, or you know, like it's good to invest in having a good relationship with your children. And there's materials, books, videos that you can access in order to work on that. if your child has told you repeatedly that they're not interested in this information, then yes, you can, there are books and materials that you can give your child in lieu of a direct conversation. But to me, that feels like a very not ideal second choice.
Yeah. Same. It feels the same way to me. And it's funny. I had the same thought. I was like, it probably wouldn't want your parents to talk to you about it because they didn't.
Right.
Right. Like, it's just very uncomfortable at this point. And it just, the thought of it just makes you cringe. And
It's
once, you know,
because we decided that it's mortifying, right? Like if they were talking about it from a young age, it's not the least bit mortifying. It's, you know, oh, what do you mean? That's what parents do. They teach their kids stuff, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Like my mother actually was pretty open and shared a lot of things with me. And I remember sharing something with my friends, or like we would have conversations and they'd be like, you talk to your mother about that, you know? And I remember being like, yeah. And they thought it was so awkward and so uncomfortable, you know? And I remember thinking like, it's actually really not uncomfortable. but yeah, I guess it's because they were speaking from their experience, just imagining having, like, they only have those conversations with friends, like not with parents,
right? You know, another thing that I talk about a lot with clients is that very often, especially for children, we always only ever lived our own life, right? Like we've never lived somebody else's life. And so to a certain extent, what we experience, unless it's like, you know, in an obvious way, extremely different from anything else, we kind of like normalize what we know and what we're familiar with. So like what you were saying before, like when my kids were younger, very often their friends would say to them, you talk to your mother about that? And now that they're like mostly adults, their friends talk to me about now I don't treat my kids' friends as clients, but they'll be like, Mom, can my friend talk to you? Of course, yeah, come, like go for Shabbos, whatever. You know, and you want to be, we as adults, you know, for our own children and for the younger generation, we want to be a resource. I mean, what more wonderful thing is there to be able to be a resource? I mean, I feel so grateful to, you know, my parents and adults that have made themselves available in different ways, in whatever imperfect ways they could, right? Like my teachers and parents weren't perfect. I had some wonderful ones, but they did as much as they could, and I'm grateful for that. And then we're learning more and building on that, and we do the same for them. Yeah. So it's a valid hesitation, the discomfort piece. But I think the discomfort is man-made. You know, if we can reframe what makes us uncomfortable, I mean, it'd be far more uncomfortable to have a kid who can't come to us when they have, you know, questions or problems that arise, and then they're either suffering unnecessarily or they have to go seek out from someone they don't know, which again, there's nothing wrong with seeking professional help, but it's so nice to be able to have the people that you love be a resource, you know, in addition to, or as a first line of defense to, you know, to figure this stuff out.
Yeah. It's so true, but it's such a cultural difference in the way that most of us were raised. Because like the way it was like, you don't talk to your parents about this. Like this is something you don't. And we're trying to change it. We're like, no, actually, your parents should be, like you said, the first line, your first resource for things like this. Yeah, yeah. And I love when you were saying before about like people's hesitation, like how do I know? I love what you said. The two things about attunement. Like if you're attuned to your child, you'll notice if they're like, no, this is too much, I don't want to. You also ask for consent. Yeah, like all those things can be ways to protect and make sure you're not sharing too much, or you're not sharing, you know. I speak to parents about this all the time. So there was a mother who recently shared with me that she shared with her son, and her son's like, she said he started looking overwhelmed, and she's like, okay, I think we're done for today. Like, so it's just like she noticed, and she was like, we're going to finish this a different time. Like, you know, you've had enough for, you know. So yeah. And then also I love what you said this another time when we spoke, where you said done is better than perfect.
Yes.
Right? Like you said.
Right.
What did you say?
That's not my line, but it's a great line.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I just remember you saying it. And it reminded me before when you were saying, like, yeah, we're going to do it imperfectly. Even now, as a parenting coach, like I said, I say information, and then, like, afterwards, a few years later, I'm like, actually, I don't agree with what I said. You know, so, like, of course, these things are going to happen. If you're going to take the risk of sharing with your child, then you might make mistakes, and you might say things, but I think what you're trying to say is that, like, it's actually more risky not to say than to say.
That's exactly it. Yes. I remember years ago, I had a rabbi who was giving a class, and he said, you know, if you think about it, it would make much more sense for people to become parents at around the age of 60, because by then you've like amassed so much more life experience. Even at my age, in my 40s, like I listen to people like you, and there's these such phenomenal, you know, young parenting coaches and experts. I'm like, I wish that I had access to that wisdom when my kids were little. And I sometimes feel so bad. I wish I could go back and rewind and redo, but like, that's not how life works. What I can sometimes do, and often do, is I'll go to my children and I'll say to them, you know, I just read something, I just heard something, and it made me realize that like I have something that I need to apologize for. And it leads to some really beautiful conversations and very healing conversations. And, you know, I think being able to model for our children that they're also going to be imperfect humans, and it's okay for them to, you know, do the best they can and then correct as they go along. And again, this is as true in the realm of sex education as it is in the realm of all kinds of education and parenting and functioning. And one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves and our children is to just like put our best foot forward, be humble, you know, like one foot in front of the next, do the next right thing, all the platitudes. You know, and I think that that's, you know, otherwise, you know, you get into like this perfectionistic paralysis of not, you know, having confidence or, you know, the wherewithal to do anything. And what a sad way to live, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, as we were discussing this, because maybe I mentioned a child feeling overwhelmed, somebody said, if you tell children too early on, they become really, I forgot the word that she used, I think it was a she, very confused, and they think about it all day, and it really affects them.
Well, I don't know where this person's getting that information from. I think that, look, there are kids who will obsess. There are kids who will obsess about all kinds of things. I know that, like, I can't count how many people have told me that the first time they heard about the word kidnapping or the word violence or whatever, they became like nightmares. And you know, I remember learning about the Holocaust for the first time recently at Yom HaShoah, right? You know, like my whole class had nightmares about the Holocaust from the kinds of Holocaust education that we got in my school, right? So, you know, again, it goes back to attunement. If you flood children with not age inappropriate information in an imbalanced way, yes, you could freak them out, which is why you want to make yourself somewhat knowledgeable, right? We don't want to like go in completely unprepared. And even if you say all the right things, meaning right as we know them to be and understand them to be right now, there's a chance that that child might feel temporarily overwhelmed. But I think that the same, you know, it's almost like saying like, don't feed your kids food because what if they have an allergy to one of those food? That we have to give our kids food, and if there's going to be an allergy, we'll deal with it at that point. But you know, that sort of fear-based approach of like, you know, depriving children of information or experiences because what if they become obsessional? What if they become fearful? Like, I think that thought process in itself generates a parental anxiety that flows down to child anxiety. You know, and it's not doing anybody any favors. So, you know, we don't show our kids horror movies because there's no upside to that. You know, we're not looking to actively scare children, but actually giving kids biologically accurate information in a not alarming way typically does not freak anybody out. Kids who are going to obsess about it are probably the kinds of kids who were wired for obsession anyway and would have obsessed about it when they found out about it from someplace else. So again, we're back to square one of like, better it come from you, better it come at, you know, a developmental point where you can process it with them rather than when they're already too ashamed and confused and overwhelmed. Yeah, you know, kids are going to have all kinds of stuff that they ruminate about and worry about, and all the better reason to set that precedent of like, hey, you can talk to mom and dad about anything because, you know, we're here for you and we're a safe place and we love you, and there's no like harsh judgment or punishing or shame about it. There's just like, what's on your mind, sweetheart? Let's go. Let's talk about it. You know, I might have answers. I might need to get back to you. I might have answers that are not quite perfect that need to come back and talk about it again. But like, we're human. We're all walking each other home, right? We're doing this together. So yeah. I disagree. I don't know who made that comment, but you know, I respectfully disagree with that. Certainly as a generalization, if that was her individual experience, again, I would say that goes back to attunement, right? Because it's always possible to give our kids the wrong response to any circumstance if we're not reading them properly or if they're not expressing themselves clearly. But that's why we get literally millions of opportunities to interact with children, because we're not going to get them all right. So
yeah, I appreciate that you corrected that, because like that has not been my experience with my kids, and I'm sure that, like you said, it could be the experience that someone has for many different reasons. Maybe it's the child's temperament, personality, the way they are anyway, or maybe it's that the parent did maybe say too much, and that could be corrected, like you said, and that could be dealt with. But yeah, I don't think across the board. I think I would also say I disagree with that statement across the board. Yeah, and I like what you said. Also, you're like, so that's why we want some level of education, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, somebody asked another question. So we do want to educate ourselves somewhat. And I actually really want to speak about your course for a moment. You said it before, and I wanted to say it now, is that what I really appreciate about your course, I have access to, like, I purchased it, right? So I watched a part of it that I felt like I needed for that time. And then there were other things that I was like, you know what, when my children get older, I'm going to do that part. And now I feel like I want to watch the other stuff that I'm like, I'm not so sure about those or whatever. And so I want to say, like, the same way you drip into your children, like you can drip the information with you as well. It doesn't have to be like you have to know everything all at once, and it doesn't have to be so overwhelming, you know?
That's great. That's great. It's almost like a beautiful, like a poetic parallel, you know, the same way you don't want to, you know, bombard your kids with too much information. You don't want to bombard yourself with too much information.
Exactly. And what I love about it is that it's so self-paced. I can do whatever and whenever. And I knew that, like, okay, I don't need to know this yet, and like, let me go there. So this person asked, like, what is the benefit? Like, what's the benefit in telling them at a young age? Why not wait till they're older?
So I feel like we covered that.
Yeah.
So
This was the same parent who was basically saying they're afraid the child obsesses and thinks about it and gets very confused. So yeah,
I guess like there's so much to say on that because these are very valid fears, but they're fears and we don't want to live in a fear-based way.
Yeah.
Again, kids are different from one another, right? You could have a 4 or 5 year old who's intuiting something about sexuality and has a lot of really intelligent questions that I think really warrant, somewhat biologically accurate answers. And you can have, a 7 or 8 year old who's really pretty oblivious, more cerebral, and not the least bit interested and doesn't seem very sexually inclined. And that's why we're being attuned and we're saying like, I don't want to give this kid more information than he or she is able to handle or wanting to know. At the same time, at a certain age, we do need to preempt what they're going to be learning out there, and when they go into the world. So that's why I don't have like an exact age timeline that I recommend. I give more like sort of developmental phrases and pieces of information, and we rely on parents to sort of it's not like a math curriculum, which also are imperfect. Not every third grade ready for multiplication tables, but what are you going to do with that standardized education? That's what happens. I actually wanted to respond to something you said before about the mom that you were working with who said like she gave her kid a lot of information and he seemed a little overwhelmed. So she's like, hey, we're going to pause for today, which was a good move on her part. But I would actually build on that and say even further. I would love a parent in that position to actually say, I feel like I'm reading something on your face. Does something I say make you uncomfortable? Do you, was this overwhelming for you? Do you have any questions? Do you want to go process? And kind of like talk about in real time what she's seeing, because if she's picking up an energy from her child that like he seems, overwhelmed or disturbed, that itself is an opportunity to even just like show him like, I noticed what's going on with you, and not just like, hit the brake, but like say like, is everything okay? Do you want to talk about that feeling, right? And at which point either say like, yeah, I just, something I heard from my friend is the opposite of what you just said, and now I don't know what to do with that. Or like, it's something that you said makes me feel really bad about something that I did, and now I want to talk to you about that. Or yeah, my brain is just mushy right now, so I think I just need to go space out or play some ball or whatever, and kind of attend to the emotional experience that the kid is having in that moment. I think in general, it's a really nice, again, whether you're talking about sex or anything else, it's a move for a parent to say like after a conversation that felt important to say like, wow, I feel like that was an important conversation. Is there anything that you wanted, kind of like, I don't know, I feel really like proud of us for having that conversation and proud of you for being someone that is mature enough for it. Is there anything that made you think of or ask or feel, just kind of like do a debrief with them.
Like addressing like the actual feelings in the room instead of exactly. I love that, and that's advice that I that really like touches me, because it's something that I really stand for, I guess, or really believe in.
Your approach in general in parenting.
Exactly. So somebody asked like, I missed the opportunity. My child's already a teenager. I didn't speak to them about anything. Like, what do I do now?
We get that one a lot. I'm glad that somebody brought that up. Okay, so first of all, you never missed the whole opportunity, even with adult parents of adult children. It's never too late to say to your child, I really love you, and I think there are things that if I had known better, I would have done differently. Could I take you out for lunch and we could have a heart to heart, right? That child might say, no, I don't want that. And if they do, that's extremely painful, but we need to honor that boundary. Sometimes what can be helpful is to, and that's obviously a more extreme case. I'll get back to the parent of a teenager in a minute, but sometimes you can write a letter or a card and just send it and just say like, here are the things that I want to take accountability for on myself and recognize that I think I did wrong for you, and I apologize, and I would like to make it right if there's some way that I can. So that that's it's never too late to try to make amends in some way. Sometimes it's too late to fix certain things that were done wrong, but we can always try. But with teenagers, I think it's like this. If you have a generally good relationship with them, meaning you're friendly with each other and you're not like in ugly conflict with them, but you just didn't really do sex education with them, I think that is something that you could play a little bit catch up. They probably learned stuff without you, but what you can do is you can say, I've been reading and I've been listening to some stuff, and I realized that we've never really had certain conversations that I probably should have had with you sooner. Can we go out one day and talk about it, right? And again, we're getting consent. We're asking. We don't want to just like attack them or bombard them. Hopefully they'll say, sure, what's on your mind, or I don't know, what is it, or they'll give you an opening to talk a little bit more. And another thing that at every age I think is a great thing to be able to say to kids is, by the way, just a heads up before we talk about this, I myself am a little nervous. This is a parent speaking, right? I'm a little nervous because this is a topic that to me feels important, and I don't have a lot of, experience talking about it or the amount of education. It's not something that I knew a lot about at your age. But I also have learned that I think it's really important for parents to talk to kids about this. So I'm going to try to talk to you about it. If you see me being a little weird for myself, it's just that. It's just that I'm nervous and I'm not used to talking about this. But that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. On the contrary, it's just something that I'm not used to. Like the same way if I went ice skating for the first time, I would feel shaky and fall down a lot, but it's still nice to try ice skating if that's something you want to learn how to do. So I think just, again, like talking about the feelings in real time as as an adult is modeling such wonderful emotional skills for a child, and saying like, there's something that I think is important. I don't feel really confident or good at it yet, but I've done enough preparation that I want to try to start. And it's an interactive process. So to say to that child, I never really talked to you about this. I kind of wish that I had, but you're still a teenager. I'm sure you probably still have questions. Maybe you've heard things, maybe you read things, anything that already, any questions that you have. Is it okay with you if I start the conversation, and then come prepared with some information and where you want to start?
I really, really love that, because I'm just imagining, like, if I was a teenager and I heard that from my parent, like, I think like it's very, like, it always makes an impact. And I think it's all, when people think that it's too late, like you said, it really isn't. It really isn't. I think that there's just like so much value and beauty in that. And like you said, they probably do know a lot of information already, but I still think there's value in having that conversation with you. Like, I think some parents will be like, oh, so they know already, so I don't have to say. But I do you agree with me that I still think it's important for the parent to bring it up with the child?
Yeah.
Even if they know?
Yeah, 100%. Yes, because again, you don't know where they learned it from. You don't know whether it was accurate. You don't know if it aligns with the values that you want them to have. You don't know if the person was a safe person who taught it to them. You don't know if the resource. A lot of people also have, like, it was interesting. I had a friend when I was growing up who was like, she was really pretty and the boys liked her a lot. So she had a lot of experience. But in our day, a lot of experience still could mean not full experience. She didn't have sex before she got married, but like everything else. And I remember she told me that before she got married, she thought that you only had sex in order to have a baby. So like if you had 3 kids, that means your parents had sex 3 times, so the point of that story is really just to say that a lot of people are missing information, even if they're not as like ignorant as we might have thought. But if no one ever gave them like the full curriculum, so your teenager might like talk a big game because, they saw stuff in movies or on TikTok or from friends, but like some of their information might be inaccurate. There might be gaps in it. And so, getting it in a more holistic way from, a responsible parent, including the values that we want to give over, about safety, about religion, about respect, about, all those other pieces. I think, worst comes to worst, it's review. And they're like, I know that already. That's fine. We're still, even if we give them nothing brand new and they know it already, the gift we gave them is, I'm someone who cares enough to have this, potentially uncomfortable conversation with you, and I'm a resource. A lot of the clients that I have are young adults who are dating or engaged or married at different stages of their newly committed relationship. And it's interesting. Some of them will very unabashedly be like, yeah, so we spoke to my mom, we spoke to his dad, and we spoke to, and they're like, there's like a lot of cooks in the kitchen of this relationship. Sometimes in a way that's like beautifully supportive, sometimes in a way that's a little dysfunctional. It's like a little too much, and there's no set formula for what that looks like. If it's working, it's working, but then there are other people who are just like, they're young people and like their parents would have no idea that they're going for help with their sexual relationship. They would never tell them or whatever. And again, that's not evil, but like, it's a shame for a parent not to be a resource, particularly in communities where there's not a lot of open conversation about it. So at least let the parent be a place where you could come and say, I'm having some pain with intercourse. Is that normal? Is that something that I could get help with? Like, so many young couples suffer with exactly that example, actually. Unpleasant or painful or discomfort, with penetration at the beginning. And, sometimes it's the kind of thing that resolves itself pretty quickly, but often like there's stuff they could do to help, or it doesn't resolve. And then it's like traumatic. And the difference between being, someone who your parents trained you, like, we could talk about this, we could deal with this, we can go for medical.
Sorry. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry about that. Okay, continue.
Sometimes there's life.
Yeah, exactly. exactly. It just went on. I was like, oh my gosh, that's loud. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
It kind of circles back to the original question one of the first questions that you asked, which is like, how does sex education from, childhood and the teen years play out in terms of relationships with adult relationships? And that's another great example. If I grew up in a home where even something as simple as like, I've had women tell me like, I had a urinary tract infection or a yeast infection for months in high school because I was like too embarrassed to tell somebody that I had like pain down there, like that should not happen. Like it should be that a kid can go to a mom or dad and say like, oh, that hurts. And like, oh, okay, let's talk to the doctor. You can get medication for that. No problem. Like that's not specifically about sex, but because it's a sexual organ, it's like one of those things that gets mixed into like the broader curriculum of being comfortable talking about our bodies, and being able to take care of our reproductive health and our, general health.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I was thinking that too. Like, even if just the value you get is that like, this is a resource. And also, I think, and I think that also maybe it decreases shame. I think that when anything's taboo, when anything's something that you cannot talk to your parents about it, and I think that's sort of like with the yeast infection, that sort of touches on that. It's like, totally. It's embarrassing. It's shameful in some way. Yeah. And it's like, it decreases that. It's like, actually, it's not shameful. We could talk about it. And it's not, maybe it's private. Like you said, like your course, sacred, not secret, right? Yes. It can be private, but it's not a secret. It's not something that like is shameful.
Yeah, it's actually, from a biblical standpoint, sexuality is holy. It's one of the first things that's mentioned in the Torah and the Bible. It's like, go have kids. This is a good thing, right? They were naked, right? That it's not meant to be something that's like so stigmatized and shameful and taboo. I think that there are other value systems that got like confused, and that when sexuality became a way that people would take advantage of one another or would practice it in a more sort of casual, less respectful way, that's where all of like the confusion and the shame set in. But in the context of like understanding our bodies, right? It's kind of like nudity, which is also part of the curriculum of sex education, right? Like we don't want to teach 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old children that their bodies are gross and dirty and shameful and icky, right? That's not the messaging. But also we don't want them to walk outside naked, right? So it's same thing, right? So same thing. Sex is not like dirty or gross or shameful. It's something that's holy and wonderful and beautiful and pleasurable, and a way for two people to experience love and connection and make more people. And there's so much beauty to it, but it has to be in the right context. It has to be safe. It has to be healthy, and it's spiritually imbued. There's a lot that's there, and that's why we give context. I think it's really important, because non-communication is also communication. When we don't communicate about something, we're saying we can't communicate about this, or there's something wrong with this. So yes,
non-communication is communication.
Yeah.
It's sending a message. Yes, I love that. So I'm noticing a few questions, and I don't expect you to answer it because I want you to answer it in a broader sort of way.
Sure.
So a lot of people are asking very detailed and specific questions, like what should I be telling my 6-year-old, or what should I be telling my 16-year-old? Or I've seen these questions really, and it's like, what's the perfect age to tell my child? What's the best time to start? I know the answer, but I want you to answer it for people, because I think people really do. They go like, what should I do? Tell me like actually specifically what to do.
Yeah. So it would be, I think, irresponsible in hour or so Instagram live to be telling strangers what to tell their 6 or 16-year-olds. I don't think that would be useful or healthy or responsible. What we are trying to do is promote awareness, introduce this idea of, just because you may not have been educated as a child or a teen, or well educated as a child or a teen, doesn't mean that we can't do better for the next generation. And to start thinking about it in a more empowered, in a more kind of like spiritually charged and health focused and positive way, and then introduce the idea of accessing resources to give more specific information, like, oh, my 6-year-old confided in me that he's been watching porn. Where do I go with that? Or my 6-year-old's been masturbating. What do I do? I'm not going to give an individual random person who posted on a live advice. It's not appropriate. Not appropriate because it's sexual. It's not appropriate because I don't have enough information. It's, not everything is the same for everyone. There are certain universals that you can use, but, like with any kind of, principle, it has to be applied with, with perceptiveness, with wisdom, with intuition, with context, with embedded in the relationship and attunement. It's more of an art than a science. But there is some scientific data, or at least statistical data, that we can use to, to educate ourselves and make ourselves, empowered and knowledgeable, so that we can do this better. There's for the, can I give a Jewish resource? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the really great books that I've seen on this is written by Dr. Yocheved Debow, D-E-B-O-W, for it's written from a Jewish Orthodox perspective. I happen to think that, you know, probably people from other religious groups would probably benefit from a lot, you know, because you can tweak the material and make it, even within Orthodox religious communities, there are, you know, differences in terms of norms and language and comfort level. But I think that, you know, she just has a really, really nice balance between like the spiritual framework, the biologically accurate information, psychologically sensitive. And that doesn't mean I agree with every single sentence, but I think overall what she does is she really did a beautiful job. I think this book is titled Talking About Intimacy and Sexuality, but if you search Dr. Debow, D-E-B-O-W,
I have the book. I have the book here. I think that is what it's called. Yes.
So she has one. There's another similar book by Sarah Diamond, C-I-M-E-N-T. It's less comprehensive. It's a skinnier book, but if you just kind of want the Cliff Note version of a similar idea, she does a great job with that. And like I said, there's also a lot more secular material than there is religious. So if you do a Google search, you'll be bombarded with like lots of really wonderful, you know, general information about sex education. I do have to say that because like almost everything else, it's become very politicized. You're going to want to be discerning and pay attention to what you see out there, because you want to make sure that the messaging aligns with what you want to give over to your children. And just another point on that is we are not in control of what our children do. We are never in control of what our children and teens do. We are in control of what we say and do with them. But, you know, we teach and then they have free will and they're going to do what they're going to do, but we influence them with what we teach them, right? So, you know, you want to be careful that both, you know, from whether you're teaching from a religious standpoint, from a biological, a psychological, you know, there's a lot of different approaches to teaching on different topics. You want to make sure that you're comfortable with what you're presenting, and that your child is comfortable with what you're presenting. And, you know, kind of like it's a dialogue. It's not a lecture.
Yeah. And I have to say that really, all the resources you mentioned are wonderful. And also your resource, your course, I think is a really, really great resource. Like I said, because it can be self-paced. I love how you write things out and have videos. I think it could work for like different parents who enjoy different kind of like taking in of information. I think it's very comprehensive and it's religious. So if somebody is, you know, observant or whatever it is, I think that it speaks to their sensitivities, which is I think it's such a great resource. Honestly, I really do.
Thank you so much, Blumia. It means a lot coming from you.
Yeah. No, and I really think it would be beneficial to parents. I really think that parents who are asking these questions, like what age and what time, I think your course really, really gives people a great framework and something really great to rely on. For me, it did. I know for me, it was really empowering and it really helped me.
I'm so happy to hear that. I have it up on my computer screen. My two favorite parts of the course are one where I go through, I think, 20 different scenarios of kids of different ages. Remember that part where they offer you opportunities. So like I have it right up here, like now a 2-year-old is being toilet trained, and she wants to show everybody she meets her big girl panties. How do I talk to her about that in a non-shaming way, right?
Yeah, I love that. I remember, yeah, you went through so many good ones. You can read more.
Yeah, I can read just a couple more. There's literally like 20 of these. You're walking in on a play date between 7-year-old kids and they're playing doctor. They're lifting each other's shirts. You know, how do we talk to them about that? You're breastfeeding a baby and a child asks why the baby is doing that. You're changing a toddler's diaper and another child says, you know, why do bodies have to be so ugly? You know, there's just so many different moments that we don't always even realize. Sometimes parents get uncomfortable when those things happen, but actually it's such an invitation. Like it's such a great opportunity to be like, hey, let's talk about that, right? You're driving a carpool, a kid says a dirty joke. Well, hey, how are you going to deal with that moment, right? How are you going to fix this, right? You know, and so the value of making oneself knowledgeable, again, via my course, you know, my course goes through all of these questions and offers, you know, possible ways of dealing with it. My other favorite part of the course, and this was such an interesting piece of, you know, sometimes you do something, you don't realize how it's going to play out in the world. So the course was designed for parents. But what I found was that a lot of the people taking the course were not parents. Some of them were single people. Some of them were people who were married but didn't have children yet. And what the reason that they told me they were taking it was because they never got good sex ed and they wanted to kind of like reparent their own sort of inner child. Like they wanted to use a therapeutic healing process. And there's one lesson. It's the only one I think that doesn't have a video component. Maybe there's one other one. It's just a list of questions to check in with yourself, because part of the premise of good sex ed and the way I present it is that we always, with parenting too, you always start with the self, right? Like so much of parenting and education, you know, what we put out is what we are, you know, what we have. And so we need to kind of check in with ourselves first and get to understand our own feelings, biases, blind spots, sensitivities, traumas, whatever it is that we have that we're bringing to the table, deal with that first so that we can present to our children with like the healthiest version of what we can offer. So it's like a whole bunch of questions. And I recommend in the text, if you have a part partner to discuss these questions with your partner. The emails and messages that I got about that specific, oh my gosh, like I would cry. Like, oh my gosh, my spouse and I had like the most intimate conversation we've ever had in years by going through these questions with each other. It was so therapeutic. It was so life-changing. I journaled. People sent me like pages and pages that they journaled. And it was like one of those things like, oh, I thought I was making a guide for parents, and it's really designed for that, but like it ended up being really a therapeutic intervention for people who are not necessarily parents. And then of course, people who are taking it as parents, if they're having those personal, psychological, relational benefits as a side, then it's kind of like you get both, then they're helping their children and also healing their own stuff, if they've had experiences that require some kind of healing.
Wow, I love that. That's so beautiful, and it makes so much sense to me, like, yeah, it's just such a great resource.
That, but like, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like even listening to you talking now, like, I hope parents are getting a feel for like how sex and sexuality doesn't have to be like taboo and weird and strange. Like, just the way that you talk about it is just so wholesome. And so, yeah, and that's how I think children experience it when parents speak about it in that way. It's just like, it just is something. It's just something, it's not like a whole, I really love like that, how you talk about it. It really does come across very, like I said, just wholesome and just like not weird. And that's what I think I wish it was for all kids.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you were just describing that observation, it reminded me of a blog post that I'm working on. It's going to be called something along the lines of like learning sex as a second language. That I think that when you grow up speaking English, then English is your first language. If you go to high school and they teach you French as a French class, then you're learning French as a second language, and your French is never going to be as fluent and as like sort of organic as your English. But the more you practice your French and learn more, then you're going to get better at it. And I think for a lot of teens and young adults, they learn sex as a second language because it wasn't sort of like something that they understood at the first stage of language acquisition. But when we can give them, again, age appropriate, calibrated, attuned information as needed as they're growing up, then it becomes really kind of a first language. They become much more intimate with their own bodies, their own thoughts, their own feelings. They understand what it is and where it's coming from and what the appropriate contexts are for it. And it just becomes a natural way to like more fluently interpret that part of the self into the appropriate outlets and relationships without the shame, with the holiness, with the pleasure, with the discipline, like all the pieces of it that can make it, the wonderful, pleasurable, connective, reproductive, all the things that it's supposed to be, without all the heavy baggage that often goes along with it.
And what a gift that is. Like, to me, that's just like exactly what we want to give our children. Exactly. Like, and it makes so much sense to me. It's so obvious to me that would be the case, right? That like, if you didn't do that way, it would come along with the shame and baggage. And if you do, then like there's so like, I love how you said it. You use beautiful language to describe it, but like how they integrate it with themselves and with the world in such a way that's so fluid and is not like heavy and loaded with baggage and weird and awkward. It's just another part of themselves that they know how to like navigate because it's always been navigated that
and
way.
That there's nothing wrong with it. Like it's just the part. It's not split off, because that's another thing that we see sometimes.
Right.
When you have like a person who identifies in a certain way, especially if they're religious, but even if they're intellectual, if they're social, whatever, and there was no place in their like comfort zone of who they are for their sexual self, then they have this like sort of underbelly of their identity of that's who I am when nobody's looking and nobody knows and nobody can know, and then there's the rest of me that's okay. And those are the people who often it's hard for them to be truly intimate when they get to a relationship where it's appropriate, because they've never really thought of that as a part of themselves that it's okay to share with another person, which it's not okay until you get to that point, but to at least share with the self, like to be self-aware with and validate within the self.
Exactly. Not to split off from yourself, like you said. Like it's like a shameful, like it's an underbelly hidden part of yourself, which that is the case for many people. I'm sure many people can relate.
Totally.
So Elisheva, some people ask, are like, could you post the resources or whatever? So what I think I'm going to do is like when I post it to YouTube and when I post it on my stories or underneath, I'm going to write in the comments the books that you spoke about by Sarah Diamond and Yocheved Dibal, right? That was it. And then
if you want, I can go and like I have on my shelf in the office and in my on my website even more so, because those are specific Jewish books, so I can give you a bunch of titles. And that way people can choose. Amazon has this great feature where you can click on look inside and sample the if you like.
So you can send me that link and I'll post it. Okay, amazing.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great.
And then people can go and see all the resources you have. And then also, can you, I'll post a link to your course as well.
Yeah. I'll do a code. Sometimes when I speak, I do like a code. I usually use code AC, which stands for affordability code. And that way, people for whom the course is, you know, it's difficult to pay for it, you could do it at half the price.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's available for anyone. If they want it for, if it's hard for them to pay for it, then they
Yeah,
can
and
AC, they can purchase it.
I have such sweet messages from people saying, I don't know if I qualify because technically I own my house. I'm like, if it's hard for you to pay for it, you can use the code. Don't worry about it. It's like, I trust you.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's like an honor system. You trust that they're going.
Yes, and you don't have to be destitute. If it's helpful to you, then enjoy. Use the code.
Wow. That's so beautiful. I'm very touched that you are doing that. And I think it could be such an incredible resource for parents. So yeah. Okay. So I'm going to post a link to that as well. I think we're done for today. I really appreciate, Elisheva, your time, your expertise, like your knowledge, your presence, just you. Like I said, the way you talk about it, I'm really, really grateful. And I'm sure that many of the parents here are as well, or all of them. And yeah, thank you so much. What'd you say?
The admiration and appreciation is very mutual. I love your work. I love you. And thank you so much for inviting me to join.
Thank you. I wanted to say, any last words, any message you want to leave parents with before we end off, or is that you feel like you're complete?
I guess I would just reiterate what we said before, because I think it's such an important message when we're talking about any area of growth that's a little bit unfamiliar, which is that don't be overwhelmed by what you heard in this live. You know, there may have been a lot of information that's new. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe you knew all this before, and that's great. But if a lot of this felt very different or very new, or just a whole different paradigm, and you're feeling, you know, guilty or flooded or overwhelmed, like try to like rein that in and just say, you know what, one step at a time. I'm going to get one book. I'm going to try. I have like the course, you start out with like a free sample. Like you could taste like a few of the lessons to see if you like the style and the tone and the approach. Start with that, see how it feels, talk to your, you know, co-parent, partner, spouse, you know, about it. You don't have to become like this, like, you know, PhD in sex education overnight. I don't have a PhD in sex education. You know, it's not like this like huge project. It's just kind of like, we're taking a step in the direction of doing a little better than we would have done before, and we're all on that journey, just maybe like at different places in our families and process. So, you know, I never want anything that I teach or say to be like a source of anybody feeling horrible about themselves, really just to be sort of like empowered, inspired, motivated to like, hey, learn a little bit more about that. That's my hope.
I love that message, and I could not agree with you more. I feel the exact same way with everything that I shared, but also with today's live. That was the point, exactly. Is I don't want parents to feel flooded and guilty and be like, oh my gosh, I'm terrible, I didn't do this. It's exactly like,
and I feel like you even say that, right? Like you often say that.
I do say that often, because it is normal for parents to feel that. Like you said, when you hear new things and you hear a different paradigm, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't do that, or whatever, or like worried and nervous. And it's like one step at a time. Exactly. We're providing the resources, maybe look into it, see, like, exactly, like move just in that direction where you're at right now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Elisheva. Thank you, everybody who joined.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye-bye.